We're one of the biggest, population centers, the youngest labor force on the planet. We have all the strategic minerals that we need for real industrialization. And we have a huge internal market that is ready, that is thirsty for absorbing the manufacturing capacity that will allow us to deploy the building blocks of development and prosperity, starting with renewable energy infrastructure to unleash our full potential, clean cooking infrastructure, clean transportation infrastructure to build the logistics of development and prosperity. So we have the internal market, we have the labor force, we have the complementarity of resources and capabilities on the continent. What we're lacking is two things. One is political leadership that is willing to work on Pan-African joint industrial policies. That's number one. And two, access to the manufacturing technology so we can leapfrog so we don't fall into debt traps.
We are going to rid ourselves of these colonialists and the new age colonialism. And for me, I think it's a blessing in disguise that things like USAID, stopped, and the Windows guy is now retrenching people, and he now wants to close his foundation. I think it's a blessing in disguise because we are going to get into a situation where we are going to have to do what we have been running away from, and that is really sitting down, imagining, and rethinking.
Africa is in a paradoxical state of underdevelopment. If you read the news, listen to our pundits, and even listen to global scholars, it seems that Africa's underdevelopment is just the natural order of things. And the best we can do is tinker at the margins to reduce some unnecessary suffering. But there's never a conception of an Africa where everybody has the highest standard of living that is available to modern man today. Half the continent does not have access to electricity, even though this is one of the most energy-rich continents in the whole world. According to the International Renewable Energy Agency, Africa is able to produce more than 1,000 times the energy it needs from renewable sources by 2040 with the right investments. However, less than 2% of all funding that goes to renewable energy development comes to Africa. Now, think about this other side of the paradox. This continent produces less than 4% of all the carbon emissions globally, but we produce 80% of climate refugees. As the climate crisis is decimating our land, causing desertification, and as people are facing droughts, our young people are trekking, taking dangerous journeys across the Sahara and across the Mediterranean to look for better lives elsewhere. And our leaders at home seem to be doing very little in the way of coming up with policies that both address the climate crisis, mitigate the climate crisis, and also assure the highest standard of living for our people. However, every second African leader is willing to sell public land to every fraud with a carbon credit scheme. And they're very willing to throw out the locals from their land and from indigenous land in the name of conservation. Now, to address this multi-layered paradox, I am joined today by Fadhel Kaboub, who is an associate professor of economics at the Denison University, and Irene Asuwa, who is a social scientist and a convener of the Ecological Justice. Welcome to the studio. Thank you for being with me today. So I want to start with Fadhel, because I think we need to start from the beginning. How did Africa come to be this way? How did the colonial process, before which Africa was pretty much, self-sufficient, and Africans were pretty much self-sufficient, how is it that we came to be in this sort of trap that Walter Rodney describes as a continent that produces what it does not consume and consumes what it does not produce?
Exactly. Well, it's very important to start from the colonial period. And I'm not saying this because I have this sentimental interest in history. We should all be very interested in history. But I insist on starting there because there are certain aspects of that particular historic period that persist to this day. And here I'm talking about the particular economic structures that were introduced by colonial powers. And these economic structures imposed three particular economic roles on the African continent. And those economic roles were not designed for development, were not designed for democracy or justice or any of the good things we want to see on the continent today. Those economic structures persist to this day. And that's why I'm interested in that particular history, because that particular history allows us to trace the pathway that led us to where we are today. And there is no pathway forward that will transform the continent unless we undo those colonial structures. So let's start from the beginning. I think we should recognize that these colonial economic structures impose three particular economic roles. Number one, we're supposed to be the place where cheap raw materials for the industrialized world are produced, and we still play that role to this day. Number two, we're supposed to be the consumers of industrial output and technologies from the industrialized world, and we still play that role to this day. And number three, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is dumped on the continent under the name of development, job creation, partnership, and all of that. But effectively, what it does is that it locks us permanently at the bottom of the global value chain, at the bottom of the hierarchy, and we still play that role today. So, how do we today expect colonial economic structures that were not designed by us, that were not designed for us, these colonial economic structures that were hierarchical, non democratic, abusive, violent, extractive? How do we expect them somehow to deliver development, somehow to deliver justice, somehow to deliver democracy, somehow to respect human rights? They cannot by design. So, if we're serious about the sustainable development goals, a just transition, or development or democracy, we have to be serious about decolonizing these economic structures that persist, undoing these economic structures, and escaping the traditional economic role that was imposed on us, meaning escaping the bottom of the hierarchy. So that is, to me, is the beginning of any conversation. Anything in terms of policy proposals, multilateral negotiations that ignores these fundamental starting points is essentially a series of tranquilizing drugs of gradualism, incrementalism, false solutions, dangerous distractions that are designed to preserve the status quo.
So, Irene, let us start from where Fadhel has left off, the decolonial process. So, a lot of African countries achieved independence about 60, 70 years ago. At the dawn of independence, you had leaders such as Nyerere, such as Sankara, whose policies were very much about self-reliance, sovereignty. But a lot of that has been undone. So tell us a little bit about the processes, the systems, the structures that exist today that have perpetuated this colonial history that Fadhel has described, such that even in the absence of quote unquote boots on the ground by colonial masters, we still are unable to detach ourselves from those three primary roles that Africa has been given to be the producer of raw materials, the consumer of goods, and the place to dump obsolete technology.
Thank you. So I think we need to define what independence is. What we got is not independence. Some people call it nominal independence. For the case of Kenya, I call it flag and paper independence, because really, even like the nominal bit, I don't think we got to that part. And so, as Fadhel has said, it's not history, it's colonialism in transition. It's continuing.
Mm-hmm.
The script is the same. It's just the shapes of how they do the script that may seem a little bit different, but it's really the same. It's still boots through militarization, genocide, and some of the things you have mentioned, the market-based mechanisms as false solutions for the climate crisis. It's gentrification. We're seeing in urban areas. It's the dispossession we are seeing of farmers through these market-based mechanisms, but also by multinational corporations that are looking to extract minerals. Is this sudden privatization that we are seeing all across the continent of water, of land, of like really infinite natural resources, the commodification of utilities that are very basic, such as education, housing, like very basic things that you need as a human being, being seen or being commodified and being privatized. And so unless you are extremely rich, then you don't have access to some of these things. And so colonialism really manifests in so many facets of our lives, and some of them consciously, some of them unconsciously. And we were having a conversation with Irene just before the segment about how even basic human, I'm lacking even the English word to call it, but things that should be innate to us as human beings, things like love, things like care, are very alien to us because that history of violence has stripped that away from us. And so it runs very deep. And also I feel we need to define what development is for the African people. Development for who? For what exactly? On whose terms? At whose and at what expense? And also, what is highest standard of living? Like, what metrics, what modalities are you using to measure a standard of living that is high and that is low? Because someone in Karen considers themselves having a higher standard of living. A pastoral person with their cows and their manyata, that is their high standard of living. And if you tell them to leave their land and their cows to come and live in Karen, they will not agree because that is what prosperity means to them. And so we have to really look through, understand, embrace. This is what Cabral talks about. He says, returning to the source. What you see as complexity, our diversity, all our indigenous wealth in terms of knowledge and everything to define, we have to use that to define what development is to us and what standards are to us. I don't know if I answered all your questions. It was a multifaceted question.
I think you answered it perfectly because it sets me up for what I really want to bring to Fadhel now, which is exactly this question of returning to the source. You know, a lot of what we consider national policies, regional policies, have very little to do with what Africans really want or what Africans really need. So how did we get to a point where the most developed countries in the world have very clearly articulated industrial policies, very clearly articulated sort of standards of living for their own people that at least they get to have defined for themselves, yet we are completely unable to do so? And how do we untie ourselves from this?
Very good question, and it's also a multifaceted question. I like multifaceted questions because we're dealing with complex issues. So this is definitely the way to go. Let's remember that the day our countries gained independence, quote unquote independence, or the flag independence, the bureaucracy of governance didn't actually change. So the colonial bureaucratic system was not a democratic system, right? It was a top-down dictatorship hierarchy, right? And the day we gained independence, we replaced the colonial administrative staff with our national staff, right? With patriots, right? But the structure remained the same. Economically, we continued to dig the same colonial mines using the same colonial roads and railroads, shipping to the same colonial ports, shipping to the same final destination, right? And this is the logistics of colonialism remained. The bureaucracy of colonialism remained. The flag changed, right? And we have a national anthem and a national football team and all of that, and that is to be celebrated. That's the effort of our grandparents' generation. They did their part, and it's to be celebrated. Now the rest of the job is on us. Our generation is to decolonize those economic structures, and that's what we failed to achieve on this continent over the last 50 plus years, 70 years almost, depending on the country. And it's not that we didn't try. Several tried and lost their lives for it, right? So we have, our generation today has to learn from the generation in between that attempted and failed and attempted and lost their lives. So that means we need to be strategic and learn from our mistakes. So, for example, I'll just pick agriculture because you mentioned the industrialized world knows exactly what they want, and they do. In 1955, as this continent was very slowly gaining independence, one country at a time, the former colonial powers, in Europe in particular, recognize that they have a problem. They have a food security problem because they were so dependent on the colonies, right? So they met in Rome in 1955 as they were negotiating the Treaty of Rome, which is the foundational block of the European Union today. And they did say, we have a food problem. How are we going to regain our food sovereignty once we lose the colonies? And they use the term sovereignty, not security. In 1962, this led to the introduction of the Common Agricultural Policy, CAP for short, which is in place to this day, a basic economic pillar of the European Union. And that is a system of heavy agricultural subsidies to support European agriculture to produce wheat, to produce maize, to produce the core crops for actual food security for their people. And it wasn't just Europe that did this, of course. The US, Canada, Australia, Japan, all the major economic blocs, including the former Soviet Union, by the way, which is why Russia and the Ukraine dominate the grain industry globally today. All of them, and they have every right to invest in their own agriculture, of course, and their own sovereignty. But what it did to our continent in particular is that our farmers who would normally be able to produce maize, who would normally be able to produce wheat and barley and all the food security crops for our people, they couldn't compete with the heavily subsidized crops coming from Europe in particular. So they were forced to switch to producing alternative crops for exports. And that is cash crops, more coffee, more tea, more tobacco, more bananas, all of those complementary food items. And that is what we mean when we say we produce what we don't consume and we consume what we don't produce. And this concept that was introduced at the time was called food security. And that is the most dangerous post colonial concept that we use to this day. And it's dangerous for reasons I'll explain, but it's also problematic because we on this continent use the term food sovereignty and food security interchangeably as if it's the same thing, because we don't recognize that food security is a technical term. It's not a colloquial term. Of course, in the colloquial sense of the term, who doesn't like food security? I like food security. But it's a post-colonial term that literally means you secure the caloric nutrition of your people, either by producing the food yourself, which we don't do anymore or as much. Number two, by importing the food from abroad, which we do increasingly. Number three, by borrowing money to buy it from abroad, which gets us into debt traps. And number four, which is worse, is by receiving it as food aid. Food aid is the worst thing you can do to your farmers because they can't compete with free food. So that's food security for you. And it produces hunger, it produces food dependency. And to close this example, I urge all of your listeners to go online and look up the name of the French Ministry of Agriculture. It's available online. It's called the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Sovereignty, not food security. And browse a little bit some of the speeches, for example, of the French Minister of Agriculture over the last few years, especially after the Ukraine conflict that caused some food, price disruptions and shortages. The French Minister of Agriculture was touring the French media, radio and TV stations, almost constantly for a period of about a month to reassure the French public not to worry about this temporary disruption. Why? Because he said, we, the Europeans, have invested in our food sovereignty since 1962. This is just a temporary disruption. Don't worry. And then he says, immediately switches the code, right? He says, I want you to worry about our African friends who don't have food security. So food sovereignty for Europe, food security for Africa. So they know exactly what they mean. The problem is that we in Africa, the general public, but especially our ministers of agriculture, our presidents and prime ministers, they need to know what we're dealing with so that when we're negotiating for climate, for debt, for development, for agriculture, for trade, we know not to keep falling again and again and again in this post-colonial trap. And that is this agriculture.
Yeah. So you've talked about agriculture, but I want us to talk also about another one of the major raw materials that Africa is exporting, which is the minerals for renewables. And especially to focus on the fact that we are now in a state of a scramble or a gold rush for renewables. Yeah. And that means that some of what we have seen in the Middle East when there was a scramble for oil is likely to be replicated on the continent. And that we could, and in the same way that we export that which we export raw materials and then barely, sustain ourselves in terms of energy, the same sort of dynamic is repeated. But I would like you to go a little bit into that, but also talk a little bit about the political economy of this as the world is changing into this sort of multipolar world, and especially with Trump's, quote unquote withdrawal from international agreements and the seeming disinterest in the shithole countries of Africa, and what you think that means eventually in this scramble for the continent's minerals.
Yeah, actually, the scramble for these strategic minerals or green minerals is actually worse than the scramble for oil, because oil was primarily a source of energy, right? But these strategic minerals are not only the basic input for the energy system of the future, but they're also the basic input of the high-tech industries of the future and the military industries of the future and the AI, industrial revolution of the future. So it is everything, right? And Africa and the rest of the global south is blessed with having the vast majority of these mineral reserves. The DRC alone is estimated to have probably more than $24 trillion worth of strategic reserves of these minerals, which explains why there was so much interest since colonial times, and that interest never left the DRC alone to develop, right? So the colonial system locked us into that model where we were supposed to export the raw materials for the rest of the world to add value to it, and then sell the finished products to us or use them to police us, right, into submission. And that is the pathway that the global north sees for the African continent. Unfortunately, the burden is on us Africans to recognize that there is no future for this continent unless we escape that model. And here's the vision that I've been presenting left and right, and I'm hoping to present to as many African leaders and global South leaders, as many as there are out there willing to listen and act. And it's the following. This is what I call the geopolitical bargain of the century: to reposition Africa and the rest of the global south at the center of a new multipolar world of peace, justice, and sustainable prosperity, at the center of a new international economic order, away from the bottom of the hierarchy. And the idea is the following. Number one, no country on this continent can industrialize alone, for a very simple technical reason. Because as a small country, like my own Tunisia or your own Kenya, our internal market is so small. And if you try to industrialize alone, which is what we've been doing for the last 60, 70 years, you end up manufacturing a small component in somebody else's industrial policy. So you remain locked at the bottom of the value chain with no real industrial vision for yourself. You're just contributing to somebody else's vision and playing a part in it, right? So that's point number one. Point number two, for real industrialization to happen, you have to have what we call economies of scale, which means you have to have a large internal market that can allow you to replicate an entire value chain within that market. And that we as a continent have that opportunity. We're the size of almost the size of China or India. We're one of the biggest, population centers, the youngest labor force on the planet. We have all the strategic minerals that we need for real industrialization. And we have a huge internal market that is ready, that is thirsty for absorbing the manufacturing capacity that will allow us to deploy the building blocks of development and prosperity, starting with renewable energy infrastructure to unleash our full potential, clean cooking infrastructure, clean transportation infrastructure to build the logistics of development and prosperity. So we have the internal market, we have the labor force, we have the complementarity of resources and capabilities on the continent. What we're lacking is two things. One is political leadership that is willing to work on Pan-African joint industrial policies. That's number one. And two, access to the manufacturing technology so we can leapfrog so we don't fall into debt traps. Because normally you pay for your labor with your domestic currency, not with dollars. You pay for your raw materials with the domestic currency, not with US dollars. So you don't really need to borrow and go into debt for that component of your industrial development. Normally, we borrow dollars to import the technology, the manufacturing capacity from abroad. And that usually gets us into a debt trap. And we do that at the national level. So it's really not even for real industrialization. That is to borrow money, to get into a debt trap, to participate in somebody else's industrial policy. So the trick for us here is how do we finance that part? And you finance it by bringing a real partner, not a neo-colonial abuser, by saying, we want you to come and participate as a joint venture partner in a win-win partnership with actual sharing and transfer of technology, including the pipeline for educational vocational training to staff that industrial policy over the next few decades. So this is now a geopolitical game because that technology that we need to manufacture and deploy the building blocks of development is available pretty much everywhere, right? But almost everywhere, we're told we're supposed to catch up, right? We're supposed to buy the technology, rent the technology, or just develop our own and somehow catch up after 1,000 years. But the leapfrogging, we're told, no, 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 you can't have access to our technology, right? So that is primarily the position of the OECD countries, of the global north countries. But there's one country on this planet that is actually willing to share technology on its own terms. But we want a joint African global South industrial policy on global South terms, on African terms. So the homework is for our political leaders to co-design the terms of that industrialization, including the terms of extraction, the protection of labor rights, of human rights, of frontline communities, especially mining communities, because we don't want to reproduce the same problems that we see in the existing system. We want this to be a different kind of development pathway, right? So let's imagine for a moment that we have not the entire global south, but let's say 20, 25 countries across the global south with a critical mass in Africa. With that new block of countries having the complementarity of resources and capabilities, having all the strategic minerals that we need, and having the economies of scale needed to get started. Imagine that group of countries with political leadership, and I insist on political leadership with commitment to this vision, going to a country like China and saying, look, we give you the bargain of the century. And here's the term of this bargain. You share your technology as in joint venture partner, in-kind contribution to unleash this industrial potential on this continent, in this block of countries, on our terms that we predefine for labor, for human rights, for extractivism, pre-negotiated distribution of the value chain among countries so that it's not South Africa at the top of the hierarchy and Malawi at the bottom of the hierarchy. All countries need to develop, as a joint block, right? We do our homework. And here's what China gets in return. In 10 to 15 years, you can double your industrial footprint globally. In 10 to 15 years, you can double your geopolitical weight globally. And you secure your access to these precious minerals that everybody's panicking about. In addition to that, if we successfully unleash this actual development and industrialization, and over time invite a larger group of developing countries, because this is once in a lifetime opportunity for all developing countries actually to escape the bottom of the hierarchy, and we become truly the global majority, then we become the largest market on the planet. The global majority, the global south, is more than 80% of the world population. But if we truly industrialize, not only are we the global majority, but we are a global majority with rising purchasing power. So the biggest market, bigger than the US, Europe, and all the industrialized world combined, with increasingly rising purchasing power. And that means that China will have privileged access to the biggest market on the planet. I guarantee you China will accept the bargain. Of course, this will have to be negotiated, and our presidents and leaders have to fight for this negotiation to be favorable to us. Now, what we need from this, because the idea here is not to put China at the top of the hierarchy, what we need from this is just triggering this process, because triggering this process gives us the second bargaining chip that we actually need to change the terms of engagement with former colonial powers. So now we can go to a country like Germany, a country like France, and others and say, look, we give you the same bargain we just gave to China. Our initial investment with China is to replicate the entire value chain of manufacturing solar panels on these terms. Now, we want wind turbine technology from you on terms that we decide, as in joint venture partners, right? And if they say no, okay, we'll try Japan. If Japan says no, say, okay, we'll go to China. They have the same technology. We'll let them quadruple their economic weight, right? Of course, they wouldn't want that. They wouldn't want to be isolated. Then we go to France and say, we want high-speed rail on our terms, manufactured in the global south with your technology as a joint venture partner. If they say no, we'll try Japan. If they say no, we'll try Spain. If Spain says no, we say, okay, we'll go to China. China has high-speed rail technology that we're happy to let them increase their economic weight. Of course, they wouldn't want that. So the idea here is not to give any economic bloc superiority or control or dominance in the global economy, but to reposition Africa and the rest of the global majority at the center of a new multipolar world of peace, justice, and sustainable prosperity, a new international economic order. And that is technically within reach, but it takes political leadership. It's not going to be academics that will strike this bargain. It's not going to be think tanks or the media or activists. It will be presidents at the highest level of political leadership with the courage to think and act differently. And that is the small window of opportunity that we have. And the Trump disruption of the global system has just made that window a little bigger, actually, not smaller. So the time to act is now.
Thank you so much. That laid out an entire sort of economic foundation for a future Africa. But I want to come back to Irene, actually, with a question about the current global investments that come to Africa in the name of climate, which mostly is happening in the realm of quote unquote conservation, the carbon credits. And that is a cover for a multitude of sins. It is a simple question, but it is very multifaceted. And I want you to go into it and talk about the various sort of cascade of injustice that follows this and the way that this is used to cover up a multitude of sins that are being perpetrated by the global north against the global south.
So first of all, a lot of money that comes into the continent, and by the way, Kenya is one of the countries that receives the highest amount of climate. I'm saying in quotes because even that we need to define what climate finance is. A huge percentage of it comes in form of debt. And they separate, there's colloquial terms that they use to claim that debt and loans are different. But for me, a debt and a loan is the same thing. But there's also a contradiction in that, because if you're going through a crisis, you can't resolve it through debt. And if you look at also the structure of the negotiations that Fadhel is talking about, and for me, I really don't see us doing much within those structures, because again, by design, there's how they are meant to work. And it's not going to work. I mean, we've been trying this for the past century, negotiating in quotes again, because negotiating insinuates that you are going to have a gentleman's agreement with someone based on a leveled playing field, which is not the case. The so-called US can walk in and out of agreements and international models as long as they want, or they can stay and not just do anything. So whether they walk in or stay is really neither here nor there. And so you look at this carbon market mechanisms, which they are trying to now use as a substitute for the other forms of climate finance. And those are like those carbon credit projects where people are leasing or adopting forests in quotes, and farmers are being asked to go into carbon market mechanisms and grow specifically the house avocado or a very specific type of tree. And pastoral communities are being told, oh, pastoralism is not sustainable. You need to reduce the number of livestock, blah, blah, blah. And you need to control your grazing. But you need to ask yourself, we're telling people in Kajiado, Marsabit, Turkana, pastoralism is not sustainable. Then another person comes in and does the same thing they're doing. So why is this other person's pastoralism ranching sustainable and not the Maasai's pastoralism? Because the person is keeping 1,000 cattle in a ranch. The Maasai is moving with 1,000 heads of cattle. Why is this sustainable and this other one is not sustainable? But you also look at this mechanism. So they're saying they're coming to support communities to all these words, resilience, mitigation, adaptation, fancy words in the climate space. But the question we really need to ask is, as communities go into RED Plus, whatever it is that they want to call those carbon credit projects, what is the community seeding? And in stories that I have heard from, I think the most harrowing story I heard was Nigeria's story, where they seeded their forest for a clean cooking company. A clean cooking company came, and before they knew it, they had given away the largest rainforest in West Africa. And so communities are ceding food sovereignty. They are ceding sovereignty over land and natural resources. Community are ceding dignity, and communities are ceding, we are ceding our agency as people, because in the African context, land, water, natural, they're not property. They're not mere extractives. We have a sentimental, spiritual attachment to these things. And so when you take away land from me, it's not just the piece of land. And the loose translation for what pastoral communities call land is mchanga. So it is not like this compact thing. They call it the soil. So it is not this compact thing. It's a medium. It's so many things to people. And where I come from, water is not just the liquid. It's more than that. It's spiritual, it's cleansing, it's it can also be non-cleansing. Like it has so many facets to it. So it's not just a liquid that you need to drink or just a mere right, which is why I also have a very big problem with the human rights framework and the so-called sustainable development goals. And I'll ask people to read the speech that Hugo Chavez gave in Copenhagen, COP, I can't remember the number of the COP, where he talks about the so-called sustainable development goals and how they are not achievable, they are not realistic under the economic model that we are in. You can't, ile number 1 or is it number 2? You can't end hunger with food aid. Like it's not going to work. And we have seen the impact of food aid in Africa, where food is like literally, I don't even know whether I should call it food, but whatever it is they claim is food, is dumped on like dumping, not that you're going to give it to help someone. You're a contract farmer, you need to pay back your bank loan. The business person is in Congress, pushing Congress people, to get their kickbacks and everything. So you're trying to break even and make profit. So it's not that people are hungry. So it's not aid, it's business. And so you come and dump these things here, whether they're in good condition or they're not, that's really none of your business. You have a bank loan to repay. And the Windows guy or whoever has leased your farm also wants his cut. And so for me, what I want us to really think about as we go into these mechanisms and as we claim to go and negotiate in systems that are inherently meant not to work, they're meant to maintain the status quo, what are we seeding? And I get very frustrated with all these COP processes because it's like every COP we go to, we come back and the situation is worse. Because now we came back with Red Plus. People in Taita Taveta lost their land. Then we came back with carbon markets. The Ogiek have been chased out of their forest land. Farmers are getting into monocropping so that they're able to go into this carbon market thing. You saw the other day people were demonstrating in Marsabit because they're saying it doesn't make economic and ecological sense to give someone your land for 40 years for them to conserve. Isiolo has become like the Gaza of Kenya because conservancies have taken 9 or 9.5 wards out of 10 wards in Isiolo. And so they have forced people into a tiny strip of land in their own land. And you also do these white elephant projects in the name of, trying to keep up with your nationally determined contributions and trying to go clean. Going clean for who? Because now you end up having a wind power plant that you are paying for and is not going into the national grid, and the community that is right next to it does not have electricity. Or you end up having a situation where you're not industrializing, so of course you're having surplus energy, but the energy is expensive. Over 70% of the country does not have access to it. So what exactly? That's why I said I will still maybe by the end of this podcast, you'll get tired of this word. We need to define what development is. And all these concepts, what is just transition? We are transitioning from what to what and for who? And what's the expense of that transition? Because even if you look at the energy conversation, we are producing surplus. Yet, we don't have access to that more than enough that we are producing. My mom does not have electricity because Kenya Power sent me an invoice of 206,000 shillings for connection only. So you're telling her to go solar. The solar that is there is the one the likes of the telecommunications industry and all these other people are peddling. It's substandard solar. It's expensive. The higher purchase scheme of paying it is very punitive. So it doesn't even make sense. And you can't use it to power appliances. You'll only use it for your lighting. And it can only go to 6 to 8 hours. And all these, are carbon credit schemes we are going into. You tell women, oh, you need this jiko. But have you read? I'll give people homework. Go and read the box for the cocoa thing and the box for the clean cooking jikos. There are conditions. Someone is counting their credits there in the name of providing solutions for women to cook. And granted, women need safer ways of cooking and everything, but also there's the clean cooking jiko that is being peddled. I have seen that jiko before. I think it is somewhere in my grandmother's backyard. So African women have always found ways to maneuver. But then now suddenly someone else came with this new technology when it has always existed. And it has existed not just because people needed to save forests, but people were crammed into concentration camps. And where I come from, people are crammed into reserves. And so you can't go into the forest. You have planted cash crops up to like literally your door. So you really even don't have space to grow trees for firewood and everything. So people needed to survive. And so this clean cooking was not even about the environment really on the onset. It's because women really need to adapt, really needed to adapt at that time to the very harsh realities of colonialism. You need to go and work in the plantation. By the time you come back, you want something that you can light up very fast. It doesn't take up too much, of the resources that you need to cook so that you make it on time. You have your reproductive and domestic labor to take care of. And so for me, these schemes, even like just beyond the extraction and the debt trap that they put into people, but it's also how the schemes absolve the actual drivers of the crisis from the role that they play. Because Coca-Cola will continue business as usual, extract gallons, billions of gallons of water. But somehow, my grandma and her peers are the ones who are supposed to resolve this by cooking with a... Does it make sense? Like, does it make any sense to you? Or somehow the woman in Muranga is supposed to grow has avocados on her quarter plan to resolve a crisis that is being caused by the oil companies. Like, make it make sense. So it really does not make sense. So these people are paying debt to resolve a crisis. If you are in Nairobi or wherever it is where you have a problem of police excesses, police kill people, you are paying debt for your son to be shot. Those people who are shot in Nairobi, their parents pay for the bullet. Why? Because that bullet is a debt incurred by the military for their military spending. And so you are accumulating debt as the crisis worsens, but somehow this debt is supposed to take you out of the crisis, and it can kill you in the process of resolving the crisis. And for me, I really want us to really think outside the SDGs and the UNs and everything, because really the solution is not going to come out of that place. You're going to negotiate.
Yes.
So let's say you are going to negotiate as the African team, negotiate. You're going to negotiate. And then the Trumps and the EU as a bloc and the G7 plus whatever and the corporations are going to sit in their tiny room after you have negotiated. And then they're going to say, this one we can't do, this one we can't do. And if you really, another homework I'll give people, go and look at the history of the climate COPs. We go 2 steps backwards, we go to the next COP, we go 10 steps backwards. And a very good example is actually all the COPs, from the climate COP, the plastic treaty negotiation, the biodiversity COP, all of them, they have regressed on their commitments. Why? Because if they do what they committed to look good, they're not going to maximize profit. They are going to need to let go of their colonies, which they don't want. They are going to need to cut their military spending. They're going to need to shut down their military industrial complex, which they don't want. All these things we are saying, if the so-called, and I'm saying so-called because I think it's audaciously presumptuous to take a section of a continent and then call it United States of America. So the rest are not Americans, like seriously. And it is an immigrant country calling itself United States of America. Like the other Americans are there. You other people came here, including the Trump that is now calling us shithole countries. And so what was I saying before I digressed?
You're talking about the cops, but
yeah, if you look at the history of the cops, we have made, you try to make a step backward, you go to the next cop, 10 step backwards. The plastic treaty, Coca-Cola said they are not going to sort out okay, they have used fashionable terms, but that is what they have said in a nutshell. They can't resolve the plastic crisis because it's going to affect their business model. The climate COP, they want us to get climate finance through market-based mechanism, which is not going to work. How am I supposed to go and extract profit from a market that is not working for me to resolve a crisis?
I think that as I listen to you, I am taken back to a conversation we had just 2 nights ago about the decline of the British Empire, the quote-unquote decline of the British Empire and its presence on the continent and especially in the country. And the conversation ended on a note around reparations, because from what Fadhel was talking about earlier, about the fact that the continent has just been a sort of center of extraction, economically. You have talked a lot about the way it has been a center of extraction culturally, psychologically, and the way in which the current global order is set up entirely to avoid even acknowledging this sort of imbalance. And that no matter what we do, the best we can hope for is to sort of hope that we can enter into this multipolar world that Fadhel has just talked about. But there is value, financial value, economic value, but also psychological value in just naming the sins of the past and making amends for those sins of the past. So instead of ending this session on more talking about just transitions and more talking about climate, I'd like the both of you to tell me something about your views on reparations and how the African continent needs to start making the claim to be paid back for what we have lost. Let's start with you, Irene, and then we can close with Fadhel.
I was hoping Fadhel has a more... My take is not hopeful. For me, I don't think it's justified that people get reparations and repatriations. Repatriation meaning like the things that were stolen, like be brought back. Like the Elizabeth, she's dead, but whoever has transcended her, bring back the diamond and the gold reserves and everything.
And the land is given back.
And the land, yes. Yeah, that's repatriation. Reparations is like paying in whatever form for the things that you have done. Repatriation is return. What you have in your reserves that you looted, return them. For me, I think what should be our topmost priority right now is a return to the source in the way Cabral talks about it and the way Nyerere talks about not going into this thing of seeing land as property, and he calls it kukatakata ardhi kama vipande vya kanzu. This compartmentalizing of land and chopping it like you're chopping a piece of cloth. For me, that should be our sovereignty over our land and natural resources should be our topmost priority. And how these people are going to leave this continent. Because they really should leave us alone. We are not going to progress if we still have 6 million hectares of land under colonialists in Kenya, or if we still have 80-something%, and now it's going to move to 90 because they have regressed in terms of their legal and policy framework. We still have a huge chunk of South Africa and the farmers. For me, that should be our topmost priority. How we are going to return to our source and define what development is to us, and how we are going to rid ourselves of these colonialists and the new age colonialism. And for me, I think it's a blessing in disguise that things like USAID, stopped, and the Windows guy is now retrenching people, and he now wants to close his foundation. I think it's a blessing in disguise because we are going to get into a situation where we are going to have to do what we have been running away from, and that is really sitting down, imagining, and rethinking. Sitting down, we start, and I think for Kenyans, we need to start with the thinking before we start rethinking, because I feel like we don't even think. So the thinking, the rethinking, and the imagining. Because as long as these people are extracting, even if they pay the reparations, as long as they are extracting, the status quo is going to maintain. And for me, I'm even thinking, in fact, if I had a magic of just shutting down the military industrial complex, just that one, it would save the planet a big deal. If we can just shut down NATO and all these things that the so-called US has turned the world into their box of military experiments, it will save us. It will save us a lot more, because we will reduce the debt. Because a lot of debt, I was surprised, a lot of debt goes into military spending. We will reduce this craze for minerals, which I also don't understand. I see people talking on Twitter about, we should exploit our oil and our coal. And I'm like, first of all, you people don't live near the mines, so you don't know the reality of what exploiting oil and coal and gold means. And what are we exploiting it for? Nigeria is exploiting oil, so have they resolved their energy crisis? South Africa is exploiting coal. Have they resolved their energy crisis? West Africa has been exploiting diamonds and gold, and what the economists call the return on investment for all this exploitation that has been going on. And so we really have to think, what trajectory of development do we want to follow? And that's why I also usually get worried when politicians make very reckless remarks and we don't think about what they mean. Like when Sakaja said he wants Nairobi to be like New York, historically and present, I don't want Nairobi to be, even in my wildest dreams, I don't want to be like New York. But if you look at, but Sakaja knows what he's saying, because historically, New York and Nairobi are following the same development trajectory. You take some people's waterways, put up an extractive city, and then the city becomes more and more gentrified and more unequal. And so when you're saying you want Nairobi to be like New York, it means you want Nairobi to have houses where people cannot afford to stay. You want Nairobi to have over 70% of its population homeless. You want Nairobi to be like this thing that is, someone said in a meme that Nairobi is beautiful to the birds, but the people who live inside are the people who want it to look. Or when the NMS guy said he wants Nairobi to be like Dubai. I don't want a concrete city with skyscrapers. That's not my idea of a live city. Is a city that speaks culturally, that speaks to its heritage. I want social halls. I want parks. I want a mass transit system, not everyone in their electric car, and then now we have to resolve traffic. I want roads that are aware of the ecological ecosystem that they are built on and are thinking of the pedestrian. I want social housing with lighting, with water, with that is spacious, that has what is it called? Aeration. For me, that is what development look like, and the Nairobi or whatever urban settlement that I would want to see. Not Dubai, like seriously.
And on that note, let's come to you, Fadhel. And what I like about what Irene has talked about is the imagination piece. And you and I have talked about this before, that one of the casualties of colonization is just the African imagination, because now the beginning and the end of everything, of the range of possibilities for us, is only that which has been presented to us, and not presented to us. In fact, it's even a step forward that some people are thinking of themselves as New York, but usually we see ourselves through their eyes. So you have Devin Day, who says the best that African women can do is to weave baskets, So so let's end on a note of, how do we reignite our imagination? How do we even face this question of reparations? As an economist, I'd be very curious to hear what you think about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the process of decolonizing the mind, so we can actually imagine a better future on our terms, not on colonial terms and colonial limits. And when it comes to reparations, I mean, it's we can we've made the case for reparations so many times: colonial reparations, climate reparations, and so on. And you can make the legal case, the financial case, the moral case, the ethical case, and it doesn't go anywhere. Why? Because it's a power question. It's as if I'm laying on the ground and you're stepping on my neck with your military boots. You've broken my legs, you've broken my arms. I can't work, I can't move. My, children are hungry because I can't feed them. And you're looking at me and saying, "Look at your situation, shithole countries. You can't even feed yourself. You can't, you're not working." And I'm sitting there and trying to make the legal case, the moral case, the ethical case. And you're looking at me and saying, "So what? You have no power. I'm stepping on your neck and there's nothing you can do about it." So we have to make the legal case, the moral case, the ethical case, but have to create the geopolitical leverage point to compel the other side to actually pay for the reparations. And when I started working on the issue of reparations a few years ago, eventually this is what led me to this geopolitical bargain of the century. Because once we reposition Africa and the rest of the global south at the center of this multipolar world, where we actually have food sovereignty, we have energy sovereignty, we have technological sovereignty, where we're actually leveraging the fact that we're the biggest, as a bloc, the biggest economy in the world collectively, then you can compel the global minority. Let's remember, you can compel the global minority to pay its climate debt, to pay its colonial debt, or face isolation, economic isolation, right? But today, we're trying to make the case for reparations on terms that are already predefined by the global north. I'll give you a quick example, because everything Irene said is brilliant, and your social media team should take those TikTokable clips and make them go viral. But if you step out and kind of add kind of the broader dimension to this reparations framework on the climate space alone, the colonial argument is also important. But let's just stay on climate, because we started the conversation with climate. As you know, Africa and the rest of the global south were responsible for a very small, tiny percentage of cumulative emissions historically. So we didn't cause the climate crisis, yet we're on the front lines of this climate crisis. The fact that the majority of these emissions are from the global north, it means in simple terms that the global north owes a climate debt. Right? And the concept of debt in economics, in law, in finance is very straightforward. If I owe you $100, I'm supposed to pay you $100, and you're not supposed to give me anything. But instead, in the climate space, instead of me giving you the $100 that I owe you for the damage that I caused to the climate, instead of doing that, I give you $3 and I tell you exactly what to do with it, and impose conditionalities on you and micromanage the way you use it. And then I lend you $7, with concessional rates sometimes, noblesse oblige, and I tell you exactly what to do with that money and get you into a debt trap, essentially. And then I say, look, you clearly need more climate finance, so I'm going to give you $20, but you have to give me your forest, right, to offset my pollution, my emissions, because I have to continue my emissions. But now you have to protect that carbon market territory that Irene was talking about. Protected from whom? From its own people, from the custodians of the land who have actually protected the forest for hundreds and thousands of years. You have to kick them out of the land to protect my carbon market territory. Right? And we call that climate finance. And then I give you another $25 of investment for my companies, but you have to de-risk that investment, which means guarantee their profits, their extraction. So you have to rewrite your domestic laws to guarantee my profitability using your land, your water, your sun, your wind to produce green hydrogen, not for you, not for your economy, not for your consumers, green hydrogen for me. So after all of this, you're sitting there and looking at me and saying, wait a minute, where's my $100? You owe me $100. Why am I giving you my forest, my land, my hydrogen? Why am I paying you debt? You're supposed to give me $100. So we need a reset of the conversation. If it's reparations, which means you repair the damage, and that reparations comes in the form of debt cancellation, at least the climate portion of the debt cancellation. It comes in the form of transfer of life-saving technologies to allow us to unleash our potential for actual development on our terms. And it comes in the form of strategic investments, transformative investments in food sovereignty, agroecology, renewable energy, and so on. And so the terms of reparations that we demand cannot be delivered by a colonial hierarchy that is not willing to give up that power. And that's why after every COP, like Irene said, this last COP was supposed to be the climate finance COP, right? And what I said after COP 29 in Baku, that this COP was not about climate finance. It was not even about climate at all. It was about a colonial economic hierarchy that is not willing to be disrupted. That's the at the end of the day, because the transformative climate finance that we want to repair the damage is going to unleash our potential, development potential, and that is perceived as a threat by the colonial hierarchy, and that's why they refuse.
Amazing. I think that is a very powerful note on which to end this really incredible conversation that we had. I feel like there are 1,000 more directions we could have taken this, which means that we must return for part 2 of this conversation. And I would really like to thank you, Fadhel Kaboub, for making yourself available today from Tunis. This was wonderful as always. Irene, Asuwa, the amazing. I'm so grateful that in Kenya we have people like you who can help to reignite our imagination about who we can be. And I want to end by a quote that that was in some of the research that my colleague Wairimu sent me earlier today as I was preparing for this episode, from the book Open Veins of Latin America by Eduardo Galeano. The rights of human beings and the rights of nature are two names for the same dignity. And so as Africans, like you said, there's a continuity between ourselves, our bodies, our minds, our souls, our spirits, and the land that we occupy. And I hope that as the conversation continues about just transitions, whatever you call that there's that consideration that these things are not just commodities, they're continuations of ourselves. Thank you so much. And thank you to our viewers and our listeners. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of A Certain Amount of Madness.